Hey everyone, welcome to yet another episode of The Cloud is Calling. And I'm excited to be joined by one of my fellow cloud practice directors here at Trace3, Adam Hicks, who leads our platform engineering group at Trace3. Adam, it is great to have you on the show and to chat about some topics that I know you're incredibly passionate about. So, welcome. How are you?
Oh, I'm very well. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, no, pleasure. It's nice to get on some platform engineering, some DevOps, some site reliability conversations. I know you are somebody who cares a lot about that world, and it is definitely a area that I think a lot of clients are getting a lot more interested in these days, it seems like.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. I think with everybody becoming more and more of a digital company, the importance of maintaining velocity and reliability is pretty key for all of them.
It is. But on that note of reliability, I've had people talk to me about observability, right? And this whole notion of organizations need to understand what's going on in their environment, understand what's going on with their applications. And it feels like people are still kind of struggling a little bit to figure out how best to implement observability. What sort of challenges do you see organizations typically face when they're rolling out a enterprise cloud observability strategy?
Well, that's a banger of a first question, Derek. That's
I'm coming
yeah,
out swinging. I'm coming out
yeah.
swinging.
And I say that because I think there's a lot of history here too. Observability is not necessarily a new thing. Maybe the way that we're being talked to about it from the industry, from thought leaders, in terms of what that term really means. But telemetry data for our applications has always been really, really important. I think one of the big challenges that has happened is cloud, and why it's such a fundamental pillar of our cloud solutions group approach. Because with cloud came distributed applications, auto healing, auto scaling, a lot of just automation in general.
Hmm.
And so it really changed how we think about it. We've gone from understanding what's happening on a server from metrics, system metrics standpoint, CPU, memory, maybe storage, IOPS, the standard stuff, and then logs for our applications or our systems that are telling us what's actually happening if they're running into errors. And now you've split those applications apart where these microservices are running in lots of different places at once, and you may have signals telling you that there's an issue in a disparate place from where that request actually generates. And the big challenge is correlating across it all. How do I narrow it down and say these are connected issues, or how do I get away from red herrings? Just because something's consuming a lot of CPU, is that a problem? Is that actually affecting user experience? So, I think that there have been a lot of attempts at standardizing on how we think about this for a few years, but
Hmm.
really at the enterprise level, one of the big challenges that we have is a lot of heterogeneity. So you may have line of business teams who are going fully cloud native into a hyperscaler, but that's just a line of business being called by other services, some which are still monolithic on premises, and that challenge of all those disjointed pieces, all those moving things, all those moving elements, is one of the biggest challenges. How do I get visibility into that whole and narrow it down?
No, and I see organizations continue to struggle with that. I mean, let alone with one cloud hyperscaler, right? Whether they're in AWS or Azure or GCP, and kind of stretching that from a hybrid perspective. How much more difficult, or does the strategy change with these critical applications that have now become distributed in, say, like a multi-cloud environment, right? You're a big Kubernetes guy. I know that about you, right? So now all of a sudden, let's take that application and it's spread across clusters that are running on different cloud hyperscalers. Does the strategy change from an observability perspective, or do the same principles apply?
Well, they do. So one of the things that whether it's multi-cloud, when we say multi-cloud, whether it's different hyperscalers or an on-prem to another, or just one section of infrastructure to another section of infrastructure, we can kind of get away from thinking about whether that's a a service that we're renting from one vendor or another, or it's inside of our own data center. The distributed challenge is really what has changed our approach. And one of the things that has popped up to address that and is tracing. That was a way for us to think about how we can propagate the context of that request across the wire, so to speak, so that we don't have to correlate on the back end and say, hey, logs from service A and logs from service B are tied together. We actually now know because we can see that. So that was really the answer to that at the outset. And I think that one of the challenges that starts coming though in a multi-cloud environment is also being able to rein in relevant other signals that we may have about the environment, because they do differ. Kubernetes has lots of layers. It is still running on a server. That can still be very important, versus in a hyperscaler and cloud native, that's abstracted away from you. You don't worry so much about the CPU usage or memory usage the same way you would have. So how do you make sure that the relevant details are alongside that relevant context if you are now embracing that novel way of understanding what that request propagation looks like through tracing?
Yeah.
Um,
No, it's good, and helping correlate all of those logs, right? All of that telemetry across environments has become, or becoming, I should say, a bit easier with the advent of tracing and being able. Um, Pivoting topics just a tiny bit, because I know this also is something that's kind of in your purview, and I will admit I'm a crazy novice, and I've been meaning to have more conversations about that. I keep hearing this term being thrown around a lot, and that's AI ops. And obviously, with the rise of generative AI and just AI in general, this is a term I feel like that's going to come around even more from this. But in your opinion, right, what is AI ops at its
yeah,
core?
another banger of a question. And the reason that I think that this one is a big question is because there's sort of a pre-ChatGPT generative boom,
Hmm.
AI ops and post,
Yes.
and so I want to bifurcate both. I think there was a time before we were really thinking about generative AI where we wanted to call anything that had an ML flavor to it AI to a certain degree. It could just be categorization, different linear regression algorithms, stuff that we're taught in statistics class in college. May fall into that category, especially on big sets of data. And so the early progenitors of AI ops and ML ops, that's really where they centered around. And I talked about tracing as a way to get a picture as it moves through an environment. And you can now contextualize a lot of the information that you have across that request propagation. But that's not always feasible for everything. There are commercial off-the-shelf applications you can't get requests to propagate through. There are segments of your infrastructure that may be somewhat invisible to a trace as well. Network devices in an on-premises environment. So where AI ops really helped was being able to take in all that data and use those regression algorithms or
Yep.
Bayesian algorithms and create correlation and say, hey, this is likely correlated. This is likely what's going on, and removing that human element of somebody saying that institutional knowledge of me having to go to Derek and say, what do you think is wrong? Do you think a network switch is saturated or a disk is full? I'm just a developer. So that was its first place. And then, of course, they kind of took it a little bit of a step further where they could use similar algorithms and do categorization of likely solutions. So you could come along and you could say, oh, Mr. Robot, you're right. It is likely this issue. I'm going to load my automation, my operational automation into here as well. And I'm going to tell you that I chose, path ABC to go solve this issue. check, and it starts taking that in and training a model for solutioning as
Mhm.
well. And then at its output, it can start making recommendations in the future if it starts seeing things that look like that, smell like that.
Yeah. Hey,
Um,
I've seen this in the past. This is how you dealt with it with workbook X or playbook X. And I think, either this exact one will work or something very similar to this would potentially remediate the issue.
Yes, yeah. So very, very powerful.
Hmm.
Really important to that hybrid cloud when we talk multi-cloud
Yep.
approach, where you have a lot of that black box. Generative AI, where it's making a splash now
Hmm.
with a lot of the observability vendors, and they're thinking through how do we now use this. So one of the things that we've seen in the observability space is a desire to interact with our data. They want to go do data science on it, and classically, like if you've been in IT for a minute, you've had a dashboard, you've dealt with dashboards, maybe you've maintained dashboards. You don't even have to be in IT. There's
No.
dashboards in all our lives,
Yep.
right? Like
Hmm.
dashboards are common. So dashboards, though, allow us really to measure things that we know about, to go into semi-known states, or maybe to go across a threshold of known to unknown. We don't really know why, but we're measuring things we know about. The big challenge in observability has always been the unknown unknowns. How do I find out what I wasn't sure about? How do I go query that data and interact with it and ask questions and do experimentation in my data, or experimentation with my applications or my systems, and start using that observability data to help back up theses I have about what's going to happen if. So querying is not easy, though. In
No.
creating a query interface, there's a lot of complexity when managing data at scale too. Storing it, do you have a database that you need indexing on? How do you index? What do you index? It's going to be somewhat different for everybody, though. All those challenges make interacting with data just a challenge on an ad hoc basis. So what ends up happening is the interface for querying it can sometimes feel a little clunky, right? I think most of the vendors have done a pretty good job of giving you a way to do it.
Yep.
But I was talking to a customer, a little bit back, and I said, "What's the big challenge with your current observability vendor?" And they're like, "Well, you have to be an expert in order to ask those questions." And so that means that everybody comes to us, and we can't just go teach them. We can't democratize that or federate access to the data in a very easy fashion, because we can't trust that they're going to be able to use it and be happy. So where generative AI is now playing a very large part is allowing people to interact with data through natural language contexts. I can
Hmm.
go ask a question and say, "Hey, tell me what the CPU usage of my server in Amazon was last week." Just like I just said it to you,
Yeah.
and generative AI will go build the query for me. And that now becomes really, really powerful, right? It gives me easy access to data. I can ask questions. I don't have to be a super genius. I still might need to have some context about what it is I'm
Yeah.
looking for, but um,
It
it's really powerful.
it harkens back to this phrase that I heard a few years ago. And obviously I'm gonna potentially inject a tiny bit of bias of my Microsoft roots here. I was at MS Inspire, and Satya was talking about this whole notion, and it was around the concept of power apps, but citizen developers. And that's what I feel like what you were just describing, right? I'm democratizing, I'm making people who are not normally a observability expert, a operations expert, right? Capable, and giving them that power to say, hey, using my query within generative AI, tell me that data so I can see it in, not to be too rude here, but layman's terms, right? Of what's going on with my application or what's going on with my server. And then I can make those decisions from a natural language perspective, being like, oh, that's an issue. Like, let me go talk to the ops folks or my developer folks. How do we fix this? How do we address the issue, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. And one other layer that I'd add on to it that kind of combines what you were asking about with some of these multi-cloud challenges as well,
Yep.
from an observability standpoint, is that we start throwing in metrics that we didn't really think about in the past. Things like cost. What's it actually costing? And
Oh,
we
it's a great question to ask.
Yeah, and we see certain businesses even starting to think about other business metrics that they may think about. This was some time back, but I had a customer that was very interested in using observability data about their systems to design SLOs around inventory management. And
Ooh.
it, yeah, so you being able to combine those now, and to your point
Mhm.
about democratizing data, you're giving the business access to ask questions that combine business metrics with system metrics and get down to root cause analysis much faster.
No, that would be powerful stuff. I know a lot of, especially manufacturing sector folks who, could greatly benefit from a lot of those things. Adam, I'm going to pass along some remaining thoughts here from you just to get your idea, and then we'll wrap up this episode. We have some other guests coming on a little bit later this season, and I would, given your expertise, would like to ask you, how would you like to be a co-host for one episode of The Cloud is Calling and continue this discussion around enterprise observability?
Oh, I would absolutely love it, Derek.
Awesome.
It's a pleasure working with you.
Yeah. All right. No, that's fantastic. I would love to have you on as a co-host, and we will get that up and running so we can chat some more about observability. I think this is a fantastic topic. I hear so much about it, not only from organizational sides, but the investment side. A lot of investors out there and other folks always ask the question about what's going on in observability. What are these organizations doing? How are they leveraging it? And I think it's an important topic for us to continue discussing. So stay tuned for that episode. I think it'll be fantastic. And I greatly appreciate Adam coming on and being a guest and then joining me soon as a co host. Any final thoughts, Adams? I'm going to hit you with one other dinger before we head out. And because I always get asked this question and I always wrestle with it because of your platform engineering background. Is the future the platform or is it still point solutions? I get asked this all the time. I always teeter between the two. I'm speaking from a DevOps perspective. I won't go down the world of security or some other spaces. But in your opinion, do you think platform is the best way to go? Do you still think it's point, mixture of both?
Well, I think the way that people are thinking about building platforms this day and age is a
Mhm.
combination of point solutions. You've got an interface for self-service that is calling your infrastructure as code to instantiate infrastructure, which of course is in your hyperscaler vendor
Yep.
or otherwise. Your software delivery or integration and delivery platform is separate itself. Your observability is another thing all to itself. So yeah, it tends to be still finding a lot of best of breed.
Hmm.
There's always been in the industry, I think, a balance between the two. There's an effort to combine, but there's only so far you can go before I think you start losing mustard a little bit.
Yeah. No,
But
I couldn't
that,
agree more.
yeah,
Yeah, I feel
yeah.
like there's what makes you great, and if you can build a platform that kind of showcases what built you, right? What is your kind of your brand, your go-to? And then if you can add a few ancillary pieces to that that help enhance it, but then very key things what I always tell people is look for those organizations that make very key alliances with people who identify, hey, they're doing something really cool. I can partner with them and help bring that into my platform and just make that better. But they're good at maintaining what they do. I'm good at maintaining what I do, and we're all better for it. All right. With that said, Adam, I greatly appreciate you being on. Thank you so much for joining me, and looking forward to our continuing this enterprise observability conversation a little bit later.
I am as well. Thank you, Derek. It was great to be here.
All right. All right, folks, stay tuned for yet another episode of The Cloud is Calling. We look forward to seeing you there. And just remember, Cloud is calling.